Hey everyone, I'm Justin with AmericanMuscle.com, here with my top picks in the spring category, available for all 2015 and newer Mustangs. Now in this video, I'm going to give you a few of my top choices when it comes to lowering springs that will offer both a mild and wild drop, in addition to a couple of competition-specific springs to be used for road racing or drag racing. Now the purpose of this video is just to give you my top picks here over the last few years working at AM, in addition to factoring in some customer feedback and reviews as well, to hopefully make your life a little easier when it does come time to lower that new Mustang. And after all, that is the purpose of this video, to lower the ride, get rid of that ugly factory 4x4 ride height, which can be a benefit for two ways. Obviously, it's gonna look much better, but in addition to that, it's also gonna help your handling performance thanks to that lower center of gravity. Now, there are a few ways to lower your Mustang, and the spring is ultimately gonna be your most affordable option. Sure, you can spend a little bit more money and go with a set of coilovers or air ride that will offer some height adjustability, but both of those options are going to be far more expensive than a basic lowering spring that we have here. So the biggest question, or the most popular question I get, is just how do I know which spring is going to be right for me and my Mustang? Well, if you've been shopping around in the aftermarket or here on the site, of course, you've probably discovered there are a million different options out there. But let's start things off by taking a look at my choice for a mild drop, and for that I went with the SR Performance lowering springs. Now these springs are definitely going to be for the S550 owners out there looking for a relatively mild drop that will lower the car, of course, but you're not going to have to worry about scraping on every speed bump or driveway in town. Now the SR Performance lowering springs are going to lower your S550 1 inch exactly, both front and rear, which is something I like to say is the magic number here with these particular cars. It's just enough to get rid of that unsightly wheel gap, but at the same time, it's not going to slam the car to the ground like my wild option will. I think this is a number you'll see with a number of different spring options here on the site, that 1 inch drop, and you're really not going to see a whole lot of aftermarket springs that are going to lower the car less than the 1 inch option. The SR Performance springs also feature what is called a progressive spring rate, and that means these springs are going to progressively firm up the harder they're pushed. This is another common trait you'll see with a majority of the aftermarket springs on the site. The reality is the progressive spring rate is going to be a little better suited for the daily drivers out there thanks to the initial spring rate, which is typically going to be a little bit lighter, making it a little bit more comfortable and not so stiff at all times. Spring rates range from 185 pounds to 275 pounds for the front and 800 pounds to 850 pounds for the rear. Now the SR Performance springs might not be a big flashy name like some of my other springs I'm going to mention in this video, but they continue to be a very popular choice here on the site with both the S197 and S550 owners alike. And as always guys, don't take my word for it. Feel free to check up on the 30+ 5-star reviews on the site, getting some great feedback from owners who are actually enjoying these springs on their personal rides. And ultimately, those SR Performance lowering springs are going to be your second most popular choice here on the site, right behind my #1 choice for a wild drop spring, and that is going to be the Eibach Sportlines. Ever since I can remember, the Eibach Sportlines were the spring of choice whenever you wanted to slam your Mustang, and I'm happy to report that really hasn't changed here with the new S550 offering. Now sure, there are going to be other aftermarket springs on the site for the S550 that will offer a similar drop, but the Sportlines continue to be a #1 choice here on the site and with myself. But let's talk about that drop a little bit more here with the Sportlines. Fastback cars or coupes are going to see 1.5 inches up front and just over 1.25 inches for the rear, while convertibles are going to see a slightly bigger drop with the Sportlines, but not by much. Now this lower stance in the front is going to give you what we like to refer to as that classic muscle car stance. It's a stance that looks great on the newer Mustangs as it did on the older ones, as you can see here with our picks. Just like those SR Performance springs we talked about a little bit earlier, the Sportlines also feature that progressive spring rate ranging from 217 pounds to 331 pounds for the front and ranging from 879 pounds to 994 pounds for the rear. Now these rates will be a little firmer than those SR Performance springs, and that will be evident when driving the car. And while the Sportlines are going to be considerably firmer than the stock springs you are replacing, the ride quality was still very much enjoyable in my opinion. Along with that very aggressive stance, you can also look forward to an immediate change in your Mustang's handling the moment these things are installed. And that's largely due to that lower center of gravity we talked about a little bit earlier, working with the firmer spring rates, which together help the car just feel a little bit more confident and a little bit more planted while in turns. The Sportlines continued to deliver big results in both the looks and handling department, making them an easy choice for me for my wild option. But what if you're into more than just good looks and better handling with that daily driver? What if you're serious about competing with your Mustang, whether in a straight line or on a road course? Well, luckily for you guys, there are manufacturers out there who produce springs that should improve your performance. Now, these springs will be a little bit different from the two springs we just talked about because they'll feature what is called a linear spring rate in place of that progressive spring rate, which means they might not be as comfortable while cruising on the road, but at the same time, that doesn't mean you can't rock these on your daily driver. First up, we have the BMR drag springs. Now, BMR is a great company that makes a wide variety of springs for many different applications. However, their drag spring for the S550 Mustang continues to be a top choice for drag springs here on the site, therefore making them an easy choice for my top drag spring. Now, in drag racing, you ideally want to run the lightest spring possible up front to help encourage weight transfer back to the rear of the car, improving not only your traction but also your launch in the process. And the spring rates here for the BMR springs definitely reflect that. You're looking at 150-pound springs for the front and an 800-pound spring for the rear. In addition to being functional, the BMR drag springs are also going to provide you with a pretty wild stance. In fact, you're looking at just over an inch up front and only a half an inch in the rear. Now, this is going to provide you with that big muscle car stance we just talked about, and also at the same time allow you to run a pretty serious tire in the rear, whether it be a drag radial or a full slick. But what if going straight just simply isn't your thing? You prefer the twists and turns of an autocross track or a road course to the straight line of a drag strip. Well, BMR does make some pretty stout handling springs that you can find here on the site. However, my top choice based off of customer feedback will be the Steeda Ultralite linear springs. A cool thing to point out here with the Ultralite springs is that they're going to be roughly 30% lighter than some of the competition springs out there and 10% lighter than the performance pack springs you can get from Ford. Now, this isn't a ton of weight, but in the land of competition, every little bit helps. As far as drop, you're looking at just over an inch for the front and an inch exactly for the rear, and they also feature that linear spring rate like the BMR drag springs we just talked about. But let's talk a little bit more about that linear or standard spring rate because that is something you tend to see a lot with competition-specific springs as opposed to the daily driver-specific springs like the SR Performance springs or even those Eibach Sportlines we talked about earlier. And a big reason companies go with a linear or standard spring rate is because you're going to get a more predictable or more consistent experience from that standard spring rate when compared to the varying spring rate of a progressive rate spring. And this is just very important when you're trying to get your car to leave consistently or when you're pushing it hard in turns. Now, sure, they might not be as comfortable as those progressive rate springs because you're missing out on that softer initial spring rate, but when competing gets a little bit more serious, a linear spring is oftentimes the spring of choice. No matter what spring you decide to go with, they are all going to install the same and require the use of the same tools: a lift, jack or jack stands, sockets and wrenches, and of course a spring compressor. Now, personally, I call the install on the S550 a strong 2 out of 3 wrenches because the IRS is a little bit more tricky to deal with than that solid rear axle of generations in the past. But nevertheless, it should take you a few hours to a half a day in the shop or garage, depending on your expertise and setup. I always like to recommend getting your alignment checked and corrected after a spring install because chances are things might be a little out of whack. Now, depending on how low you go, you might need to start thinking about things like caster camber plates or camber bolts to get everything back in the spec correctly if the factory parts can no longer do that. Nevertheless, your local alignment shop should be able to advise you on that. That's going to do it for my top spring selections for your 2015 and newer Mustang. I hope it helped you on your quest to lower your Mustang, and guys, keep in mind, these are merely just a few suggestions. There are a ton of great spring options out there that will do the job of lowering your Mustang and improving your handling. I'm Justin, thanks for watching, and for all things Mustang, keep it right here at AmericanMuscle.com.